各位来宾午安我们艺术银行下午场的讲座即将开始。那在麻烦各位来宾需要语音翻译的话，请戴上您的耳机。那频道0是中文，频道2是英文。Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The International Trade Forum is going to start in a minute, so please wear your headphone for translations and Channel 0 for Chinese and Channel 2 for English. 各位来宾好。那我们艺术银行国际趋势论坛下午的第一场演讲，将邀请到我们英国国家典藏档案室主任 Roger Golding 先生，以艺术外交、英国政府艺术收藏机构的运作为主题进行分享。那并邀请到国立台北教育大学艺术与造型设计学系的林志明教授主持。那我们首先请以掌声欢迎林教授。
各位好非常高兴来这边做这个主持。我发现我们这是一场其实非常令人非常重要也非常令人兴奋的一个演讲跟讨论那我们的整天的这个议题呢是有关于艺术呢作为外交的利器powerful tool for diplomacy。可是这个对于而且是 culture， 我们那个议题上面说是 cultural diplomacy， 文化的外交可像我们在台湾的话，可能这个问题会更怎么讲敏感因为外交这个问题在我们台湾就是不只是一般的问题外交可能是断交，可能是非正式的外交，我们正式的邦交的国家并不多所以文化在我们的国家里面呢，它可能不只是艺术或文化，不只是文化外交的问题也是外交的非常重要的一个管道当我们没有所谓正式的外交关系的时候所以就对我们国家整体呢是一个非常重要的问题。那今天这个 Roger Golding 先生呢，来自于英国那我刚刚看他的简介呢，他是掌管这个英国政府的艺术收藏的部门里面的档案室主管而且他本人呢就不只是一位档案室主管他懂很多这个资讯的问题他其实也是艺术家跟这个策展人所以我相信这面他有非常丰富的知识跟经验跟我们分享。那我们就用非常热烈的掌声来欢迎他。
Is this on? Give me a moment to get my stuff together here. Dajahao. Now, I'd like to say first that I'm coming to this from a slightly different perspective from most of my colleagues so far. I am a documentation specialist, and the core of my work is actually managing a database of works of art for the government art collection. My work also extends into several other areas, particularly historic files on the one side, so the archive, but also in the other direction towards websites, social media, and public outreach. I also deal quite a lot with open data and data sharing initiatives and projects sharing data with other organizations. So, in such a small organization, it's inevitable that everybody has to pitch in and do quite a lot of everything. So, over the years, I've been there for 30 years now, I've had to do almost everything in that time, and I've seen a lot of stuff. But what I am not is an academic. I come from an artistic background and a technical background and a documentation background, so you'll need to bear that in mind throughout what I'm saying. I'm going to be trying to cover quite a lot of territory in this talk, so and I might need to skip some of my presentation if it goes on too long. I'll have to rely on you guys down there to keep me on time. So the Government Art Collection. We have a collection currently of about 14,000 works, excuse me, in around 380 buildings around the world. Now, about 2/3 of that collection is in buildings outside the UK, and the other 1/3 is in buildings, government buildings within the UK. Our stated aim is to promote British art and culture. Now, our main sphere of activity outside the UK is in British diplomatic buildings, rather than in, say, public exhibitions or events, which is the focus of other organisations, most notably the British Council. However, we do lend our works of art to public exhibitions wherever possible. We move several thousand works of art every year. And the logistics and organisations of that effort, as well as monitoring the works of art in all those buildings, still forms the largest part of our operation. In the past, information provision and public access has been secondary, but over the past few decades, it's becoming significantly more important, so that public-facing, public access agenda is becoming more important. I was quite interested when I started putting together this talk that there actually is very little information in our organisation about what it is that we do in regard to cultural diplomacy. And in fact, when I started talking to people about it, I found there was very little understanding of what the concept really involved. People understood the concept of culture and the concept of diplomacy, but actually putting the two together in one idea didn't make intuitive sense to most people. So the initial guesses were that it involved a somewhat negative idea of using culture, generally in a narrow sense of the arts, as a tool or instrument of diplomacy, i.e. culture harnessed in the service of diplomacy and government. And it's probably inevitable that an element of that exists in any display of works of art in government buildings or in a diplomatic setting. It is a concept that has been implicitly or explicitly rejected by many who have written on concepts of cultural diplomacy and related ideas of soft power and public diplomacy. The promotion of mutual understanding between nations and cultures dominates current thinking on the subject. The Institute for Cultural Diplomacy gives the following definition: a course of actions which are based on and utilize the exchange of ideas, values, traditions, and other aspects of culture or identity, whether to strengthen relationships, enhance socio-cultural cooperation, or promote national interests. Cultural diplomacy can be practiced by either the public sector, private sector, or civil society. Most of the work in the collection is by British artists, but there are exceptions. We have 3 Andy Warhol prints of the Queen from his Reigning Queen series, and I actually quite like the idea that Andy Warhol appropriated an image of Queen Elizabeth II for this work, and then we have kind of reappropriated it back in a cultural diplomacy setting, which is possibly not quite what Andy Warhol had in mind when he did it, but I think it works. Cultural diplomacy is allied to the idea of soft power as opposed to hard power, and Joseph Nye made the original definition of soft power as the ability to persuade through culture, values, and ideas, as opposed to hard power, which conquers or coerces through military might. So what is the place of cultural diplomacy in the public sector or government? Again, to quote from the Institute for Public Diplomacy, whilst the hard power approach has historically been favoured policy of governments in conducting international and regional relations, the increasingly interconnected world stage highlights the need for cooperation on a new level. This is where the role of soft power as a form of cultural diplomacy becomes significant. On this basis, cultural diplomacy is not secondary to political or economic diplomacy, but rather functions as an intrinsic and necessary component of it. So while the idea of promoting national interests is still very much on the agenda, the idea of dialogue and exchange of ideas has become more important than a simple projection of a message. Cultural diplomacy is often thought of in terms of events and campaigns focused on the public. Thus, the display of visual art in government buildings may be regarded as a narrow or minor aspect of that. Nevertheless, a strong case can be made that such displays play a significant role and wield influence out of proportion to the apparent scale of the project. These are two installations, one in a diplomatic building in London, which is mainly used as a conference centre, and the other is in the British High Commission in Colombo. The GAC's main audience is not normally composed of people coming to a building specifically to look at art, but in most cases will be absorbing the experience of art and culture as a side effect to their visits for other purposes. An audience does not need to make a conscious decision to go to a gallery or museum to encounter art. The GAC's work allows people to engage with visual culture as part of their daily lives, the same sort of encounter that supports initiatives such as good urban design, public art, art in hospitals, and so on. So you'll see the Downing Street in London is used for many receptions, and it's a historic building with a lot of interesting art in it. The building on the right is a building we were involved in a substantial series of public art commissions for about 15 years ago, the Home Office building in London. The wider public becomes engaged through printed journalism, TV reports, websites, increasingly social media coverage of political and diplomatic events, which show usually incidental images of works of art, but on occasion journalists and social media coverage publicize the works of art themselves and the context in which they are displayed. These are just a few sample clips, mostly from Facebook. The one on the bottom right is actually from the British representative in Taiwan. The work behind him is a work by the artist Martha Marseille. Cultural diplomacy is generally understood to encompass a much wider definition of culture than art, so national identity, history, religion, and so on. GOC's work is more focused, working within the bounds of government buildings within and outside the UK, and almost entirely dedicated to fine art in that context. The art itself stands for and communicates many messages about British culture and identity. So the proposition that the GAC's work makes an important contribution to cultural diplomacy is relatively easy to understand and agree with. Just to explain here, this is the traditional hang of works in the glazed gallery in the ambassador's residence in Paris up until virtually the end of the last century, with royal portraits from our imperial past. Since then, we've been doing a rotating display of contemporary works in the same area, which you can see on the right. It's changed about every 2 or 3 years. Defining an equivalent role for works displayed in government buildings within the UK is slightly more difficult. In some buildings that receive a significant proportion of visitors from overseas, for example 10 Downing Street, the Foreign Office and international conference centres such as Lancaster House, a cultural diplomacy element is clearly evident. This was a temporary display by Michael Craig Martin for a conference about 20 years ago. In other buildings, the audience is primarily staff and visitors from within the UK, so an equivalent idea of cultural advocacy whereby the works of art promote the artistic and cultural heritage of the UK within the UK may be more appropriate. Just as within diplomatic buildings abroad, their presence stimulates creativity and communication, encourages discussion and debate, and can inspire and/or challenge visitors. However, the connectedness of the world today means that both public media and social media means that images and information about these and national rather than internationally focused displays may be publicized and so have influence in the wider world, good or bad. Thus, an element of cultural diplomacy can be implicit even in such displays in the UK. I'll come on to more about the press later on. So this brings me on to the subject of branding. According to the official website of the GREAT campaign, the Great Britain campaign showcases the best of what the UK has to offer to inspire the world and encourage people to visit, do business, invest and study in the UK. It is the government's most ambitious international promotional campaign ever, uniting the effects of the public and private sector to generate jobs and growth for Britain. So, it's a straightforward, unambiguous project to promote Britain. There have been previous national and international campaigns and movements, both official and unofficial, from the Festival of Britain in 1951, I'm Backing Britain campaign in 1968, the Cool Britannia movement in the 1990s. Events in support of the Great campaign take place all around the world in pretty much the same countries and cities that the GAC already works in. And we've been involved in a number of projects, usually when these take place in embassies and other diplomatic buildings. Within the concept of using art to promote culture, there's a kind of continuum between using art as a tool for diplomatic ends, being selected and displayed with an overt or didactic political agenda, and allowing the art to speak for itself, and perhaps with perhaps specific soft cultural aims somewhere in between. In the end, the best art transcends attempts to use it for political ends, to the extent that messages can be read into or gleaned from a particular work of art. If that message is in alignment with the political agenda, it may help that along, and the reverse must also be true. But art can be used more subtly and strategically. In the end, that will have a better outcome. It's better and more meaningful art in the context. The tacit message is quieter and less overt and thus not so controversial. Using art to push ideas of national culture into an international audience is a concept that, while it's always likely to be a component of the diplomatic scene, is becoming more difficult to sustain as an end in itself. The reality of the contemporary, highly connected world is much more complex. The work of the GAC should, and in fact does, involve much more nuance and complexity, and increasingly resembles much more of a dialogue than a didactic statement of, this is who we are. This is a, as it says here, a traditional salon-style hang of prints in the British Embassy in Washington, but with a modern twist to it, which is the visitors actually find quite unexpected. So, what is the effect of cultural diplomacy? How does one measure it? Attempts have been made to measure global trends in soft power on a country-by-country basis. Things like the Elcano Global Resource Index and others have produced rankings of nations in regard to the soft power, in which the UK has gratifyingly scored consistently very highly. This is from that authoritative source, Wikipedia, but I think it's reasonably accurate in terms of reflecting the original sources are. What these macro trends hardly reflect the day-to-day reality of what we do. So to what extent do we actually do cultural diplomacy? How do you quantify it? Is it even possible? Statistics derived from website usage, visitor numbers, to the GAC's own building and public events in government buildings, such as London Open House, museums at night, events at diplomatic posts, they're all interesting but not necessarily useful in demonstrating a causative link between our activities and specific diplomatic outcomes or behavioral effects or any increase in cultural awareness or understanding. External events, in particular the recent GAC exhibition series, have generated statistics in terms of visitor numbers, feedback and reviews. Public tours of the GAC's own premises are very popular. Demand outstrips our resources to provide them, and feedback forms provide a lot of useful information and comment. Visitor surveys may be useful in terms of evidence, but doing that in the context of diplomatic buildings is problematic. Some government buildings and embassies keep records of the numbers of visitors, although often only of those coming to special events rather than everyday visitors. The statistics are not directly relevant, as visitors are not normally coming primarily for the art. However, they do provide an overview of the volume of people who come into incidental contact with art from the collection. Measurements such as the number of works the GAC places in diplomatic buildings and the relative proportion of historical, modern, contemporary works in different buildings, frequency of change of works over time, all of these may be useful indicators of trends. However, how those works were selected, for example, if the choice was driven primarily by GAC curators or by a particularly engaged ambassador, for example, to what extent the choice was driven by the desire to showcase British art in general, or to make links to a host country, or to focus on specific themes. All of these could be analysed to provide potential information. It's all very interesting, at least to someone like me who loves statistics, but does not entirely address the question of what effect the display of works of art from the collection in government buildings actually has. Where is the benefit? How do you measure the success of cultural diplomacy? The main evidence that we have comes from a mass of anecdotal evidence, culled mostly informally or through second-hand sources from diplomats, ministers and civil servants over many years, and from articles in the press. This is actually a press wall we did for an exhibition. And not all of the press feedback is complimentary, of course. So, a couple of examples of how we make links. We have works on display in several diplomatic buildings in New York. Some of the works selected have links between the artist or the work and the city itself, or aspects of American culture. So we've got here a portrait by John Michael Wright of King James II as Duke of York. And some of you may know that the city of New York was actually named after the Duke of York, not after the city of York in Britain. I'm losing my place here, beg your pardon. So we also have a pen and ink drawing called Jazz Fans by Edward Burrough, who made many trips to New York in the 1920s. A Texan landscape by Peter Lanyon, who with its direct homage to the American abstract expressionist movement. And then not quite such a direct link, but a work by Isaac Julian, photographic diptych from this Fantôme Créole series, which comments on global issues around women's work and emancipation, and also indirectly on the slave trade from West Africa. Comments made by diplomats can be illuminating. Sir John Sowers, former British permanent representative to the United Nations, believes that art can play a specific role. He explained modern British art sets the stage for modern British diplomacy. The art demonstrates style, quality, and a distinctive British approach, as we try to do in our diplomacy too. Karen Pierce, former deputy permanent representative to the United Nations, told us, many colleagues from the Commonwealth, the UN and the US see this art and it makes a big impression on them, not only through the quality of the wonderful works themselves, but because of the message they send about a modern UK engaging in the world. That all sounds very good. Oops, sorry. In June 2013, a G8 summit took place at Lough Erne in Northern Ireland, and we were approached by the team at 10 Downing Street to provide a range of works for display at the summit. You will see here works by Elizabeth McGill, who has a Northern Irish background. The Prime Minister actually wrote a letter of thanks to us and said the art provided a wonderful backdrop for our discussions and was much commented on and admired by the attendees. So it all sounds great, but it's, again, this is all anecdotal evidence. Coming back to the idea of measuring the effects of cultural diplomacy, debates on cultural diplomacy, soft power and public diplomacy have sometimes included discussion on the possibility or otherwise of measuring their effects. At a conference held at the Ditchley Foundation in 2012, the director reported that many participants thought this was a vain exercise. Qualitative assessment and analysis was the best that could be hoped for all the weaknesses of such essentially subjective judgment. Others took the view that measurement was impossible to avoid and that the tools had to be improved. Given the difficult economic conditions we have experienced in recent years and the importance of making a robust case when negotiating for Treasury funding, we believe it's important to test how and to what extent such measurements can be made in regard to our own work. So to this end, we are developing a postdoctoral research project specifically to address this issue, starting in 2017. It'll be funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Paul Mellon Foundation, collaborating with York University, to look at evidencing the effect of the GAC's work, including the aspect of cultural diplomacy. I'm now going to go back in time a bit to talk about the history of the collection and hopefully in doing so shed a bit more light on how and why we got to where we are today. The art critic Andrew Renton, in a conversation with Cornelia Parker and Penny Johnson, the director of the collection, said, "I have this fantasy that artworks are actually influential, that they change your state of being, that they might actually make you think again. What's very clear is a lot of GAC works that are installed today are far more than just decoration. You cannot not notice them. They don't just recede into the background." The government art collection as it exists today came into being in 1980, although we date the origin of the collection back much further to the the beginnings of the 20th and the late 19th century. However, in 1980, there was a reorganization that created the GAC following decades when the collection was a function and responsibility of other government departments, mainly the Office of Works and its successors. In 1828, the Office of the Lord Chamberlain transferred the furnishing function of all government buildings to the Office of Works. And the Office of Works gradually took on management of works of art that already existed in government buildings as a result of that. Between 1898 and 1907, official sanction was given to acquisition of new works and an annual budget of just £300 was set. I believe that's around about 14,000 Taiwan dollars at current rates. The initial justification of this was based on the idea that large, inexpensive paintings could save a good sum on decoration. In other words, they felt that they could hide cracks in the plasterwork by putting big paintings there. This rather morose-looking gentleman is Sir Francis Mowat, who was the Treasury official who gave sanction to that initial budget. So he's something of a hero to us. The earliest works in the collection were mostly royal portraits in buildings abroad and portraits of political figures in the UK, so projecting a particular view of Britain. Some of these works were quite impressive and imposing, not least because of their size. These large painted versions of royal paintings, portraits were supplied mainly to the more important embassies. This is quite an interesting photograph from the Illustrated London News of the British Embassy in Beijing in 1900. That's an interesting date. Some of you may be aware that that is the middle of the time when the diplomatic area of Beijing was under siege from what, at least in Britain, are still known as the Boxers. Somewhere I wrote down, I think it's the Yi He Tuan movement, something like that. I'm not sure of the pronunciation, but so this looming portrait of Queen Victoria presiding over the dining table in the British legation, obviously giving a very direct idea of the British pluck and bravery while being besieged by these nasty Chinese people. The transition from projecting an image of imperial and colonial power happened quite early. Although many of the works acquired were portraits of political and diplomatic figures, the focus of collecting rapidly changed. The strand that started with wall decoration developed into a full-blown desire in the 1920s and 30s to both showcase British culture and at the same time compete with the efforts of other nations, notably Italy, France and Germany at that time, on the stage of world diplomacy. This is a painting called The Valley of Mexico by Daniel Thomas Edgerton, who is an interesting British artist who unfortunately was murdered in Mexico not long after he painted this. The files from the period, and there's a pile of files for you, covering the first half of the 20th century contain repeated references to and complaints about the lack of good quality works, the importance of loans to fill gaps from both diplomatic posts and government buildings in the UK. In fact, during that period, loans formed a significant proportion of the works available for display and may have outnumbered government-owned works at some times. Two successive acts of Parliament relating to loans from public collections led to restrictions on the period of time works could be lent for, which in turn meant large numbers of existing loans had to be returned, and there was a subsequent reluctance to pay for transporting new loans for such a limited time period. And it was partly that withdrawal of loan works that drove a rapid increase of acquisitions following the end of the Second World War. So, back to cultural diplomacy. The term itself was invented relatively recently, but in truth it's actually been practiced for centuries, both formally by diplomats and informally by travellers and artists. The portrait of the left is a traveller, archaeologist, soldier, explorer, Charles Irby, in Arab dress in Egypt. And on the right is an important portrait of Lord Byron by Thomas Phillips. So in fact, the GAC was actually doing cultural diplomacy in a sense long before the term was invented. We acquired this portrait in 1952, and it's now regarded as the major portrait of Lord Byron. And since then, it's been on display in the ambassador's residence in Athens, with only a few breaks for public exhibitions. Byron's connections with Greece and the respect and admiration with which he is regarded there makes the prominent display of his portrait a significant and valuable cultural link between the two countries. Occasionally, we're able to make use of instances of cultural diplomacy initiated by others and to build on those. So an interesting example was the visit of a group of artists, politicians, and intellectuals to China in 1954. Works by two of the artists involved, Stanley Spencer and Dennis Matthews, have since been bought for the collection and make useful cultural connections between the two countries. Commissioning has been part of the acquisition process since the early years. The first notable example in the modern era came in 1949, when John Piper was commissioned to produce a series of works for the interior of the ambassador's residence in Brazil, which was then in Rio de Janeiro. And his neo-romantic style was very much in tune with the image the government wanted to project. The 5 paintings he produced, referencing the architecture of spa towns of Bath, Cheltenham and Brighton, were considered to be among his best works to date. But when the capital later moved to Brasilia, the paintings did not fit well with the new building and so were dispersed over several locations. It was not until 2012 that the works were finally reunited in one of the GOC's exhibition series at the Whitechapel Gallery. In 1953, with the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II approaching, the ministry took the unusual and adventurous step of commissioning a range of artists to produce work documenting the event. One of the artists, Ellis Lowry, was somewhat bemused to be asked, as he considered himself a painter of gritty northern working-class realism. The painting he produced was later displayed in Moscow, and Lowry wrote delightedly, "They think I'm a communist because I paint what I do." The commissions for the coronation produced one of the first instances of an awareness of an obligation to the wider public beyond the walls of government buildings. So, following the completion of the commissioned works, they were shown in what was the first ever public exhibition of works from the collection. Over the years, the GAC has been involved in a range of commissioning projects, from individual pieces such as sculptures for the grounds of embassies to large-scale building projects involving multiple site-specific works by many artists. Around the turn of the millennium, two major new buildings, the embassies in Moscow and Berlin, were the focus of a series of significant commissions. So you see here a sculptural work by Tony Cragg, Dancing Columns, and the walls of the area are decorated with a pastel wall drawing by David Tremlett. The legacy of site-specific commissions can represent a challenge, consideration of which should ideally be built in from the start. Sometimes we only have the benefit of hindsight. Long-term maintenance and conservation issues, changes in building use, even international political developments have all been encountered. The reunification of Germany after 1989 led to the British Embassy and residents moving from Bonn to Berlin. 20 years earlier, the artist Ian Hamilton Finlay had been commissioned to make a site-specific work for Bonn at a time when an event such as the fall of the Berlin Wall was not envisaged. As there was no suitable space for it at the new residence in Berlin, a new home for it was eventually found in Malta. However, contemporary materials and processes can contribute solutions to such challenges, notably by creating works in the form of manifestations, which have the potential to be refabricated and remanifested in other situations. This work by Henna Nadim was installed in the headquarters of our parent department. They moved buildings about 3 years ago, so these have now been taken away, but we still own the rights to the works and the digital files and can potentially remanifest them somewhere else. So, it's probably true to say that anyone who's worked for the GAC for any length of time becomes, if they weren't so already, an advocate of the idea that works of art accrue meanings not necessarily envisaged by their creators. Meanings may be acquired or modified based on their display history, changing with context. In the words of the artist Cornelia Parker, a work that is not overtly political can become so in certain environments. By displaying the works in government buildings that are not formal museum or gallery spaces, additional narratives accumulate around these works that are unpredictable and often surprising. These become part of the history of the work, in which layers of meaning arrive in non-curated ways different from those mediated by formal gallery exhibitions. This is just a quite amusing example. Prime Minister Harold Wilson in the 1960s believed that the security service had planted bugs behind the picture in the photograph. For many years that was denied, but in fact it turns out that he was probably right. I'm turning now to some of the challenges and some of the benefits of operating in the way that we do. Many of these are open-ended, evolving situations and questions, answers to which are not yet clear, such as, does being part of a government organisation have an effect on the nature of displays and on the overall aims and policies of the collection? Well, of course it does, but perhaps not always necessarily in ways one might expect. Adequate funding for acquisitions has been problematical during many periods in the history of the collection. The last few years have been particularly difficult. A moratorium on new acquisitions from April 2011 until March 2013 was the first time that no new works had been purchased since the Second World War. Low levels of funding in general mean works by major established and historical artists are not affordable. So this means that the collection needs to buy work by artists when they're still relatively unknown, which in turn means maintaining a highly active and critical knowledge of emerging artists. And these are just 3 examples of, as it were, works that were purchased before they were famous. One of these is a Turner Prize winner, and the other 2 were Turner Prize nominees some years after we acquired these works. What we do is a form of direct state patronage, unlike the more arm's-length Arts Council and British Council and the nationally funded museums. So what do we do about work that does not fit the model or is too difficult to display? Opportunities are more limited for the GAC to present cutting-edge works than for a gallery. However, it is surely important not to overlook that type of work and to keep aware of it and use any opportunity to push the boundaries where we can. The same criterion might also apply to work that takes a critical position in respect of British history, culture, or politics. However, to quote again from the Ditchley Foundation, any kind of overt propaganda would certainly not wash with today's global audiences, who needed to feel that they were being told the truth. Artists who are expecting criticism of aspects of the life in their own country or on overseas visits could have a bigger possible effect on that country's image. They were embodying the values of honesty and tolerance. Good cultural ambassadors needed to be edgy. So works with content that's otherwise difficult, but that can use humor to subvert the model, can work very well. So this is Grayson Perry's print called Print for a Politician. It depicts a huge range of different groups: cultural, political, social, professional, religious, ideological, gender-based, and other groups, all in apparent conflict. Since we acquired it, it has in fact been displayed on more than one politician's office wall. Perry has said, "My work has always had a guerrilla tactic, a stealth tactic. I want to make something that lives with the eye as a beautiful piece of art, but on closer inspection, a polemic or ideology will come out of it." Another interesting example involves a work not by a contemporary artist, but by one who died 75 years ago, Sir John Lavery. This painting depicts the appeal by Roger Casement against his conviction for treason in 1918. Casement was both a British diplomat and an Irish nationalist. In April 1916, he was captured after landing in Ireland following a mission to Germany to enlist aid for the Irish nationalist cause. Later that year, he was put on trial for treason and condemned to death. And after the unsuccessful appeal shown in this painting, he was executed. That is Casement. That is Casement there in the dock. And Sir John Lavery's viewpoint from the public gallery directly facing him makes quite an interesting composition. This year is the centenary of Roger Casement's trial and execution, and also of the Easter Rising. In fact, this is exactly 100 years to the day since the Easter Rising, one of the key events that led to Irish independence a few years later. So the ability to look back at these events and the history of this period with an objective eye requires that we give critical attention to works of this kind that they deserve. There are parallels with some of the work shown at the recent Tate Gallery exhibition, Artist and Empire, which deals with difficult questions of the British colonial past. This work, depicting a key event in one of the most difficult and controversial periods in British-Irish history, is thus of exceptional interest, and its importance as part of the British Government art collection can hardly be overstated. So, what about our relationship with government departments and buildings where we show our works? The position of the collection as part of a government department means we do not have a financial or contractual obligation to our clients. We're not bound by supplier-client financial constraints. As a result, we work in dialogue with ministers and ambassadors, and we can refuse requests or negotiate different outcomes, and we can exert influence and thereby create potentially more interesting and perhaps challenging displays. We can also negotiate different financial approaches For example, by obtaining funding from other government departments to cover certain costs, or where commissioning works for specific buildings. We're able to engage in potentially challenging curatorial discussions on displays and maintain a critical distance free of the constraints that might be imposed if the clients were paying for our services. That position has also enabled us to make use of the collection in different contexts. For example, the series of exhibitions we put together in 2011 to 13 involved substantial planning and cooperation across different government departments and buildings around the world to manage both the content of the exhibitions and the logistics of moving works from their display locations and providing replacements where necessary. We also directly involved government staff in the curatorial process for 2 of the exhibitions. Given that the GAC is part of a government body, it's all the more important the GAC is understood to be effectively independent of government direction, with its own curatorial agenda, making its own decisions. The role of the Independent Advisory Committee is key here. It's important, but perhaps not always fully understood, that most of the art displayed on the walls of government buildings is provided by and curated by, or at least in collaboration with the GAC, not as a direct expression of government policy or individual ministers' or ambassadors' ideas. More often, though, we face practical challenges, and operating according to museum guidelines on a limited budget can sometimes bring us into conflict with the short-term needs of our clients. We're an accredited museum, so we have to meet national and international standards, and the need to find optimum value for money by, for example, combining loads and scheduling installations to make best use of resources can sometimes clash with the needs and wishes of politicians. Political considerations are only one of many aspects that may need to be considered in making a display, but the political aspect occasionally takes a much more central role. And in those cases, we may need to tread a somewhat narrow and difficult line. In 2001, Prime Minister Tony Blair asked the GAC to provide a suitable work for loan to the White House during the period of George W. Bush's presidency. A bust of Winston Churchill by Jacob Epstein was selected and accepted for display in the White House. The press interest in this story over the period of the loan was interesting, to say the least, and persistent misinformation, blatantly incorrect stories were the source of much frustration and an annoyance, and some of those stories still get recycled now. Journalistic coverage may not always be favourable or helpful. The press in Britain seems particularly interested in stories about art and stories about government spending, so we have to deal with that quite a lot. There are certain types of works we can't display, so don't acquire. And we also need to be aware of cultural sensitivities, especially when placing work at embassies. Despite the best intentions, mistakes can happen. This work was chosen for display in the British Embassy, the new British Embassy in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. It hadn't actually been acquired, but they were considering acquiring it until somebody pointed out that the filling in the sandwich bore a suspicious resemblance to ham. And given the cultural taboos on eating pork products in Islamic countries, that would have been a considerable diplomatic problem. So it was not actually acquired. The importance of working in collaboration with local staff and colleagues cannot be overstated. For the new building in Doha, in Qatar, the GAC commissioned Jonathan Parsons to create a work to be integrated in the fabric of the building. Initial plans were to build a design into the walkway of the entrance. When he discussed the project with local staff and colleagues, he discovered a strong cultural idea that anything that's walked on or over would be regarded as unclean. And as a result of those conversations, he changed the focus and made it work for the main glass panels overlooking the entrance. I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to move on more quickly. We do try to push the boundaries whenever possible, which requires cooperation and open-mindedness in regard of diplomats. This is a performance that we actively collaborated with the British Consul General in Chicago by a performance by Robin Deacon. We also have unexpected and unforeseen events which happen. When buildings come under attack, for example, the 10 Downing Street on the left during the Second World War, and on the right, the British ambassador's residence in Tripoli in 2011. These are works get destroyed or damaged as a byproduct of more general violence. Occasionally, they are attacked deliberately. So in a deliberate act of iconoclasm, the British embassy compound in Tehran in Iran was attacked, and several works were damaged or destroyed. Interestingly, all of the ones that were badly damaged were portraits. There are also potential risk of displaying works in a certain context that might be implied as criticism, or at least provoke unexpected criticism. So when a British embassy opened in Moscow after the revolution in 1917, Russian guests were sometimes surprised to see what they took to be a portrait of the overthrown Tsar Nicholas II, only to discover it was in fact the portrait of the British King George V, who were in fact cousins, which accounts for the close resemblance. On the other hand, historical events may make possible what previously would not have been contemplated. This painting called Derek Boshier features images of Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, Abraham Lincoln, Admiral Lord Nelson, Buddy Holly, and refers to the ideological struggle of the space race and Cold War politics. At the time, it would have been unthinkable to place the work in a diplomatic building in the Soviet Union. However, diplomatic events and sufficient historical distance have made it possible for the painting to be installed in the ambassador's residence in Moscow in 2010. Again, I'm going to have to push on. It may be thought that artists whose work may contain political comment or critiques may be reluctant for their work to be acquired by government. However, it seems more likely that they see it in a positive light and perhaps even view it as a way of exerting influence from within the establishment. Again, this is an example of using humor to put over a rather difficult message. Relationships with the press. Well, it's rare for politicians to try and make overt political statements using their choice of art, but changes to what is displayed on the walls of their office is one way they can be seen to be doing something quickly. Politicians are often confronted with the reality of political, bureaucratic, and legal processes required, and one of the few things they can actually change quickly is the art on the walls. But press interest in ministerial choice of art following general elections or reshuffles is often high and frequently focuses on the supposed links to the psychology or aspirants of the incumbent. The cutbacks due to austerity in recent years have brought challenges. Responding to this with a direct appeal for money would be much more difficult today than it has been in the past. Approaching private companies, as happened in the 1950s, for example, would be almost impossible. So we have been looking at additional ways of raising funds apart from our funds that we get from direct government, and at different ways of acquiring work. So we have been able to get more gifts into the collection, and we've also been working with an organization, a philanthropic organization called Outset, that enables gifts of works of art from artists to public collections. Decisions over what to acquire are made by GAC curators with the advice and assistance of an advisory committee. The GAC's acquisitions and disposal policy is in line with the UK Museums Association national guidelines and is a public document. When it comes to matters of policy, direct involvement by politicians and senior civil servants, whether in terms of influencing acquisitions, changing or going against established policy, is a risky business and needs to be judged very carefully if it's not to be seen as political interference. There would be a significant risk of devaluing the reputation and influence of the collection in the eyes of the public and of the art world. The acquisition policy is under constant review. What does not change is the need for continuous development of the collection through acquisitions. It's important but difficult with a limited budget to acquire works that fill significant gaps in the historical modern collections. Another main strand of collecting policy reflects the changing face of the British art world, as well as developments in the wider cultural and social context. The proportion of works by women artists and artists from diverse ethnic backgrounds, as well as works whose content reflects the ethnically diverse nature of Britain, has increased dramatically over the last couple of decades. There are some more examples. The last 2 decades have seen a dramatic increase in the amount of effort we've put into public access of various forms. We now have a website with most of the works of the collection on this, and I would suggest you go and have a look at it. Since 1953, the JAC has had several public exhibitions on a small scale, but only recently have we been able to mount any large-scale exhibitions, and from 2011 to 13, we put on a series of 5 consecutive shows over a 15-month period, which was a fairly massive undertaking. And sometime in the next 2 years, we will be moving to another building, which is just along this street here, at the north end of Whitehall in central London, and for the first time have a small but publicly accessible exhibition space. How does this tie up with developing the cultural diplomacy role? Well, we live in an era when international political and diplomatic agenda changes quickly. Cultural trends and artistic practice sometimes seems to change even faster. The last few decades have seen seismic upheavals and realignments in global power structures, new wars and conflicts, and on the cultural side, the emergence of new players in the international art scene and a more global internationalized art scene, and the extraordinary acceleration of prices of art at auction. It's clear that the GAC will need to continue to change and adapt both to new diplomatic realities, whatever they should be, to changing artistic practice, and also to changes in understanding of and attitudes towards our own culture and history. The importance of the UK's position as a global artistic hub, attracting artists from diverse countries and cultures, informs and diversifies the UK's cultural offering. For the GAC, that means it's important that we continue to acquire and display works which reflect this contemporary diversity, so that the GAC can make an active role in making connections between cultures. Equally, it's important that we continue to develop and improve the historic side of the collection, continue to acquire historical works as well as contemporary works. This is actually our most recent acquisition, and it's the first painted portrait of Henry VIII that we have ever owned in the collection. So the GAC's mission statement to promote British art and culture, while still having some truth in it, does reflect an old model that is increasingly out of step with the contemporary art world, and in fact the way in which the GAC increasingly operates. The reality of what we do is more complex and nuanced, and I would argue that we are moving from the simple projection of a cultural message to one where the artist and the works of art participate in a dialogue, to use that very overused term, with the spaces that the works inhabit, the cultural and historic context of those spaces, the public who visit those spaces, and the wider audience connected via public and social media. A dialogue through which all parties become changed and through which it is to be hoped greater understanding will emerge. Thank you.
我们让他准备一下啊，他装他的耳机啊。那我非常高兴哦，有这样的一个演讲。我觉得他这本身的演讲就已经是他的这个文化外交的一部分了啊。他就很成功的把英国的这个整个的这个历史啊，他在那个 政府的这个艺术收藏里面的整个历史、整个这个问题的深度哦，甚至他们做了什么样的成就，我们都已经可以管窥到。尤其是他的照片，不只是他特别选的一些照片啊，不只是那个作品的照片，对不对？还有那些作品跟甚至世界上一些重要的政治领袖啊，怎么在会议啊，或者是他们在实际上在运作，就是那个情境里面的照片，我觉得那是让我们很有感受的一个事情。好，那现在欢迎大家来跟他提问啊，跟Mr. Golding 先生提问。So now I'm inviting the questions. 不知道大家有没有什么问题？ Actually, I have many questions myself. We have time to do it later, so I perhaps invite all the audience. 我邀请大家来问，因为我们之后还有讨论了啊。我觉得在这个就是他讲完这么丰富的这个营养之后，就立即给他一个回馈是很好的。Okay, perhaps myself. Okay, so you can talk about the. I think there are at least 2 missions to showcase the soft power, British soft power in culture and art, and the other one is you just say that, but not so clear. A kind of a political agenda behind. Yeah, still there's kind of political agenda. Can you say more about, for example, more concrete about what kind of political agenda that could be? 我的问题是说我来翻译一下。我的问题是说，其实他有提到一个很重要的关键点就是在谈这个文化外交的时候，会有这个政治上面的议题在背后出现，但是他同时有一个责任，就是去当做你的这个文化跟艺术的这种 soft power 柔性这个国家的柔性实力。软实力的一个展现，那这两个里面可能会有一些冲突或者一些问题那他有提到，但是我觉得那个没有很具体的案例所以我想请他再解释一下。
Yes, it's actually quite difficult and complex. There is no one answer, and there's no official policy, at least that I'm aware of, in terms of projecting British politics or culture via artwork placed in embassies, for example. So it all happens as a kind of informal process, which is mediated partly by the government art collection, partly by the ambassadors, and so on. So to say that there is a political agenda behind it, you can say that there is an informal political agenda behind it, but it's not something which has ever been stated or written out. So I think that, as I said in the presentation, we are moving from a position where it was effectively projecting an image of Britain to the wider world via such campaigns as the Great Campaign in that kind of very overt sense, to sort of subtler displays of works of art showcasing what Britain is about and our culture and history, but it's moving much more now towards that state of a dialogue. Because we only work with, or almost only work with, works of art from Britain or by British artists or artists working actively in Britain, we don't work with in the same way as, for instance, the Art in Embassies program, with directly with the local artists in any particular country normally. So that's something very different. We're still in that position where we are pushing Britishness out there. But as I say, it is actually a changing, evolving situation, and I think the situation will probably continue to change indefinitely, and quite possibly will change a lot over the next decade or two. That's just my opinion.
And another question, okay, I will keep it for me, please. 先从这位先生好，然后后面再等一下这位女士。
非常感谢您这个精彩的介绍，感觉时间可能有一些短了。那么我的问题呢，就是说您在最后呢提到呢，现有的英国政府艺术收藏的模式呢，可能会有一些滞后。那么因为时间关系呢，您也没有再详细的展开。那么我的问题就是说，您认为现在的这种滞后性，那么是在现有的这样的一个体制下是有改善的空间，还是说，那么在随着市场的发展，现有的这样的模式可能慢慢所起到的作用会越来越有限？您能不能详细再说明一下？谢谢。
I am quite optimistic about the future in terms of the British government's attitude towards both public diplomacy and to the display of art in public buildings. Having said that, the constraints of difficult financial conditions are totally unpredictable, and that makes it quite hard to predict what's going to happen in the future. We're in a better position now than we were 2 years ago, but that's a moving target, and we never really know a few years in advance what's going to happen. The other factor is that the very existence of the government art collection as an entity has been threatened at various times over the years. There have been efforts to either sell it off, privatize it, change its mode of operation radically, merge it with other organizations, and so on and so forth, none of which have actually come to fruition. But again, that doesn't mean to say that couldn't happen in the future. So what this actually means in terms of how things will happen, it's a extremely uncertain picture, but we have existed in one form or another for 118 years now. So with a bit of luck, we'll keep on going and keep on changing and improving.
那刚刚举手这位小姐。
Mr. Golding, thank you very much for your abundance sharing. It's such a wonderful presentation, and I really learned a lot from your presentation. My question is going to, you mentioned about many times, it's very important for the factor of public access, to your work, also for GAC. I'm just wondering, can you tell us more about how to measure the performance of a public access?
Public, sorry.
Access.
Public access.
Yes. Sorry, I have
measuring the effect of public access.
Public access.
But sorry, are you saying how to measure the actual effect?
Yes, some kind of, you can say, effect.
Yeah. Well, I think I talk quite a lot about statistics and visitor numbers and so on and so forth. What we are working on is a way of actually documenting more fully and finding ways of measuring, or finding ways of pinning down what is currently only anecdotal evidence. So, for example, all of those, nice, kind comments made by ambassadors or visitors to the GAC headquarters or whatever. We don't know how to do that at the moment, and that is precisely why we are actually commissioning a study to see what there is out there at the moment, how we could possibly do it better, possibly how other organizations in similar positions measure it. But it's a big unknown for us, so I'm afraid I really can't tell you very much. I'm hoping that something interesting will come out in the next couple of years.
Okay, and sorry, can I ask another question? According to your speech, if I'm wrong, please correct me. I think a national identity is very important for GAC. How to construct the national identity for British governments. And can you let us know about what's the British national identity related to your work?
Again, it's a complex and difficult question. I mean, the nature of British identity is a hard enough question to answer anyway, given that we are actually several countries merged more or less happily or unhappily into one. And representation of all those different strands of culture and identity in one organization is almost impossible. So what we are doing is a mixture of historic reflection of historical, the history of British culture through historical works of art and also contemporary representations of Britain, British life, and through representations of Britain abroad. In a sense, I suppose one of the exhibitions, one of the themes of the exhibition series that we put on was about British travellers abroad. And that's one of the big strands of British life. I mean, the flip side of the whole colonial and empire business is the fact that there's a kind of diaspora of Britishness right around the world, which still exists today in so many countries. And British travellers abroad have informed the art so much that plays a very two-way kind of effect. So there's a whole lot of things going on, and trying to pin it down into one single strand is very difficult. We just have to try and do lots of things in different places.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
所以我们时间已经结束了，还有问题吗？立刻，如果不到现场，好，没有我们就用热烈的掌声来谢谢他。
那我们再次谢谢林教授以及Roger 带来的这么棒的分享。那我们接下来就就大概因为我们休息时间原本是因为时间比较晚了一点，那我们休息时间也一样，我们原定是40分开始，那我们就再休息个那我们再给大家休息，可能去上个洗手间之类的休息。休息个5分钟，我们再回到我们的展览论坛的会场。那再请大家接下来参与我们的综合座谈。好，谢谢。各位来宾不好意思，那我们下一场综合座谈时间从3点开始。不好意思，那个更正一下，我们就是3点再回到我们的现场参与接下来的综合座谈。那各位，我们外面有准备一些简单的茶点，那各位来宾也可以在外面休息一下，然后享用我们的茶点。那茶点无法带进我们的演讲厅里面来，谢谢各位。